Thank you. Thank you, Abby, for recording. Thank you for joining our training today. So today's training will cover 2 resources for supporting the implementation of community-driven water system consolidation projects. And so this training will be split up into 2 presentations. Our first presentation will be given by Kristen Dobbin, Assistant Professor of the Cooperative Extension at UC Berkeley and UC A&R, Greg Pierce, co-director at Luskin Center of Innovation at UCLA, and Justin McBride, a graduate student researcher at UCLA. And in our second presentation, it will be given by Jordan Huang, a senior software developer and project manager at FlowWest. And with that, I will pass it over to Christian, Greg, and Justin to begin our training. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. And thanks everyone for being here this morning. It's awesome to see such a big and diverse crew of folks tuning in today. As mentioned, again, my name is Kristen Dobbin. I'm an assistant professor of cooperative extension at UC Berkeley and UC Agriculture and Natural Resources. I guess I should go ahead and share my slides here. Share screen. And today I'll be co-presenting with my co-authors and colleagues, Greg Pierce at Luskin Center and Justin McBride at UCLA. And we're really happy to be here today to talk with you about all things designing water system consolidation projects. And the bulk of what we'll be presenting today comes from a guide entitled Designing Water System Consolidation Projects, that's pictured here, that we released in October 2022. And the guide's going to have everything we talk about today plus more. So certainly don't worry if you're not catching all the details or you want to go back to something. That is a great resource that we'll circle back to at the end. And today, for the purpose of the presentation, because of time constraints, we'll kind of stay a little bit higher level and really try to do a good job illustrating why we should and can think about designing consolidation projects and how we can use that information to try to maximize benefits in the projects we're moving forward and advancing. Well, there we go. So our presentation today will have 4 parts. I'm going to start with a discussion of options for structuring consolidations and then do the same thing for governance options. And then I'll pass it over to Greg, who will go over considerations for evaluating consolidation proposals based on kind of the information I share. And then Greg will pass it over to Justin, who will walk through our digital toolkit and how you can put this information into practice in your own work. So we're going to try to leave plenty of time for questions at the end of our hour segment here before we turn it over to Jordan. But if you have any clarifying questions, please do interrupt us. You can throw that in the chat, and then maybe one of the moderators could let us know, just so that we're not leaving anyone confused as we move forward. And then we'll get to those bigger questions at the end. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge and thank the hard work of our advisory committee, who really supported and gave all their expertise and feedback to make this project as useful as possible, including some I know in the room and colleagues of some in the room. We really benefited from hearing from TA providers to create this guide, and we know that you all are experts on this information as well. And so we hope that this is a useful tool you can use in your projects. And we're sure that you have, lots of insights that can be added to this work to kind of implement consolidations and insights into how many of these questions play out on the ground. Funding for this came from the National Science Foundation as well as Water Foundation. We're grateful for their support. So just to set the stage, I thought I would maybe begin with a few statistics about California consolidations generally. So over the course of the last few years, we have documented approximately 185 unique consolidation projects in the state. And these are projects that were completed, so not in progress, but the consolidation was completed between 2015 and 2021. And notably, some of these projects consolidated more than one system. So it's about 200 or 204 systems that were actually consolidated in over the course of these projects. And overall, these projects, about a quarter, a little less than a quarter, 12% of them were managerial consolidations, meaning the vast majority were physical consolidations. And I will note that physical consolidations have a bit more documentation and they're easier to find. So it could be we're missing some of those managerial consolidations out there. But I do think by and large, consolidations in the state thus far have been skewed towards physical consolidations. And as I think everyone knows, the vast majority of these are voluntary consolidations, with only about 1% being mandated under SB 88. So consolidations are pursued for a wide variety of reasons. I think we all know this, but the vast majority of consolidations really are pursued for water quality concerns, and that might explain this bias towards physical consolidation that we're seeing. But another really important thing to know about all these projects is that they are extremely, extremely diverse. They take many, many forms, and I think that's not new news to anyone on this call. So it's not a stretch to say that every consolidation project is unique. It's sort of just kind of fact. But our premise today is really that this diversity matters. Both how a collaboration is structured and who governs the consolidated system informs the benefits, the outcomes, the challenges of that project. And so that's what we really want to dig into today. And to some of you, this might be intuitive. I know probably several of you, many of you have worked on one or many consolidation projects and seen this through your own work. And for others who maybe haven't worked on consolidations projects, this might seem a bit obtuse, but we're going to walk through both components of this in this first part of the presentation. And I think it will become a lot clearer. But before I do that, I want to say that when it comes to consolidation projects, there are not always multiple options. And so sometimes there's only one collaborative structure that's going to be feasible. And oftentimes the governing body of the receiving system is what we have to work with. We can't necessarily change that governing body. So it may seem odd to you that we're asking you to compare alternatives. But I want to emphasize that even when there aren't feasible alternatives to a consolidation, one specific consolidation proposal, it is really important that we understand the benefits, the drawbacks, the challenges of that structure. And understanding kind of the structure and governance and how that informs the project can help us anticipate and deal with challenges. It can help us shape expectations of residents and even shape our own expectations of what will happen from a project. And it can help us identify additional actions that might be needed to address challenges that won't be resolved by the consolidation. And so we'll come back to this at the end, but I want to say up front, in case that's what you're thinking in the back of your mind, that even where there aren't multiple options to compare feasibly, it's important that we do this work of breaking down and understanding the implications of the structure, of the governance, so that we understand how that's informing the project at hand. Okay, so I'm going to start by doing an overview of the options for structuring consolidations and talking a little bit about the trade-offs involved in these structures. So generally in our guide, we talk about there being 3 options for structuring collaboration in water system consolidations. And it's important to note that this is really a spectrum of collaborative arrangements, and it's totally possible to create consolidations that exist kind of at various points along this spectrum, but these are kind of useful archetypes that we found kind of helpful for talking about these alternatives. So on one end, we have an umbrella organization. And so this is a collaborative entity, often a joint powers authority, that is formed kind of above the existing water providing entities to coordinate and collaborate on some portion of drinking water provision. And so in some cases that might be they're coordinating and collaborating on kind of the whole running of all the systems. And in some cases that might be a more restrained role. But the important thing here is that we have an umbrella organization in addition to the pre-existing systems. So this is very different than a merger where 2 or more water systems are joined to create a new or altered entity that is kind of responsible for jointly operating and managing the water system of both. So it becomes one water system. And finally, we talk about acquisition. So this is a challenging term because I think a lot of us think of investor-owned utilities when we hear acquisition. But when we're using this here and in the guide, we're not just talking about investor-owned utilities. we're talking about scenarios where a water system takes over another water system, and that larger water system may not undergo many changes from that transition. So this is often that happens when one water system is much smaller than the receiving system it is consolidated into. And again, this is a spectrum of collaborative opportunities, but these are kind of the archetypes along the spectrum that we are using for the purposes of the guide. So how does this matter? I've said that it matters, but let's really dive into how and why. So to kind of do that, or to start us out, I want to provide a hypothetical example. So I made this up, they're silly names. But in this hypothetical example, we have Happy Days Community Service District, and we have Celebration City, and they're neighbors, a couple miles apart maybe. And they both have ongoing arsenic challenges, and both are seeking a long-term solution. So if the two are thinking about consolidation and how they might structure collaboration between the two systems, one route could be to develop a joint powers authority umbrella organization. And that joint powers authority would have representation for both systems. And they might use that JPA to build and manage an arsenic treatment plant. And then the arsenic treatment plant provides water to each system, and those systems individually and autonomously distribute that water to their customers, bill their customers, and operate their own systems. Another route they may go is for Celebration City to annex the community of Happy Days. Happy Days CSD is then dissolved, and Celebration City is now actively serving all residents under the same city umbrella. So both of these would probably solve the arsenic issue, right? But I suspect many of you know that they have different implications for residents. And so what we really want to do with our guide and our presentation today is dig into those differences and provide a resource for thinking about the pros and cons of different approaches. So I don't know if anyone in the chat wants to throw some initial thoughts about what the pros and cons are between these two options, just to kind of get us started before I go on. But I'm sure many of you have thoughts, because these are different and they mean different things for the residents served by these systems. Any ideas?
So, hey, Kristen, this is Armando.
Hi, Armando.
For the JPA umbrella organization, if they don't have something written specifically into their bylaws, let's say it's just one example that we're working on is there's 2 school districts, but let's say that in their bylaws they can't provide water to community members along that pipeline, then it's they can't do that, but it has to be written, I guess. So it's very limiting what the umbrella organization or the JPA could do depending on their governing structures or their bylaws.
That's a great point. Thank you, Armando. And I see that Rob Burnett from our CAC also said potential zoning changes. So it's particularly with that annexation of Happy Days CSD, those residents of Happy Days CSD, which were likely unincorporated residents, are now residents of the city, right? And that comes with all kinds of changes for those residents that far transcend water provision. So yeah, both great points. And yeah, thank you both for helping me illustrate this point, right? That these are different. So the next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the, I'm calling them pros and cons. I don't mean that in the kind of judgmental way, but kind of thinking through some of these differences. So for umbrella organizations generally, there are some of the pros, and we talk about more in the guide, so these are not exhaustive, are that they're really flexible, right? You can write that agreement to say and do really anything you might want it to. It's a very flexible tool. There isn't also a need for any type of regulatory approval. Joint powers authorities are formed between members, and then you just send notification of that formation to the Secretary of State. And there's also a joint powers authority is going to maintain separation between these entities, right? And that could be useful if there's different financial or debt issues between the water systems. It could be useful if there's differences in water rights. If we're talking about surface water between the two water systems, sometimes that degree of separation is useful or important. But kind of as Armando also pointed out, there are cons with umbrella organizations. They can create redundancies. Oftentimes we'll have a board meeting for the Joint Powers Authority, and we have board meetings for the individual systems. We might have staffing and administration at both those levels. They can be easier to dissolve. Again, this is based on how they're written, but they can sometimes be written, or oftentimes are written where someone can pull out. So their kind of sustainability or future guarantee is maybe less than other forms. And also this kind of removes representation a little bit from residents. So the Joint Powers Authority, rather than representing residents, generally represents the CSD and the city, which then in turn represent residents. But you can see how we're kind of slightly getting away from residential representation there. So again, there are more, but here's just kind of start to think about some of the pros and cons of an umbrella organization. Mergers, so where we have two water systems and they merge into one, and you kind of make basically a new entity that governs the joined systems. A pro of this is that it's tailorable. Oftentimes, this is where we see a lot of those governance choices on the table, where there is more opportunity to make choices based on what local residents and stakeholders want. This is also a good way to ensure representation for residents. And there's likely more economies of scale benefits here, right? We're pooling tool systems, but we're not creating the redundancies of administration or management. So we're really hopefully maximizing economies of scale. But on the con side, there are downsides with each of these types. These can be pretty difficult to do, right? And anyone who's tried to go through the LAFCO process of forming a district or amending district boundaries, there's a lot to do there. And again, this can also, like the annexation of Happy Days CSD, influence the provision of other services. It can have changes about locally allowable land uses, taxation, right? As you're changing government boundaries, that has changes for residents that might go beyond water system provision. So, and finally, acquisitions. So this is where kind of one larger water system basically takes on the smaller one, and we don't see a lot of changes. So a good example would be a mobile home park on the outskirts of a city, and the city just starts serving that mobile home park. Some of the pros here is that sometimes this can be a really a somewhat straightforward way to address a drinking water issue without broader changes. So for example, if we're doing extraterritorial service agreement to a mobile home park, we're not annexing them. This might be a pretty straightforward and relatively quick, although we all know consolidations don't move quickly, way to get safe drinking water to that mobile home park. This is also can be a really good way to address capacity issues, because basically that small system can dissolve and not need to kind of continue managing and operating their own system. But on the con side, when this happens through extraterritorial or out-of-boundary service arrangements, this can result in customers not having representation in the decision-making around their water system. And there can be regulatory hurdles here. Sometimes it's not possible to approve extraterritorial or out-of-boundary service. So again, there are more pros and cons for each of these. This is just kind of to highlight some of those. So all of these considerations are things we need to be taking into account when we're talking about a specific consolidation project, whether we have options to do a merger or maybe extraterritorial service acquisition, or whether or not we don't have any options. These are things we need to be thinking about for the project. So then before I hand it off to Greg, I'm gonna go over kind of the similar thing about options for governance of consolidated systems and the trade-offs involved in those. So at a high level in the guide, we talk about there being 5 general options for governing consolidated water systems, really any water system, governing water systems in general. But it's important to note there's actually really 26 options in the state. For independent special districts, there's more than 11 independent special district types serving drinking water in California. But for the purposes of this, we're grouping general purpose governments, those counties and cities. We're grouping all the independent special districts together. And then we also have investor-owned utilities, nonprofit systems, so most commonly mutual water companies, and then joint powers authorities. And you can see from this graph, or table, sorry, you can see from this table that between 2015 and 2021, consolidations are most frequently happening into special districts and general purpose governments, and then followed by investor-owned utilities. So we don't see a ton, although we do see a few consolidations into nonprofit systems, as well as some into other types of facilities like schools or private facilities, for example. And the pathways that systems are going, kind of like the types of transitions we see through these consolidations are really diverse. There is a lot happening. And I think many of you know that because this is part of what makes each consolidation so unique. So between 2015 and 2021, we see, I think, over 25 different types of governance transitions through consolidation. And so again, I have a hypothetical example to get us started in thinking about why this matters. And so for this one, we have Obsidian Mobile Home Park, which has experienced several recent water outages due to an unreliable well. And residents are sick of the unreliable water service. They want to consolidate with one of two neighboring systems in their vicinity. One of those systems is an investor-owned utility, and the other is a county water district. So let's say if they consolidated with the investor-owned utility, that has certain implications. One of the implications is that would require approval from the California Public Utilities Commission, who regulates investor-owned utilities. Rates would be set by the utility with CPUC oversight. Residents through those processes might have access to low-income rate assistance program, which is something that many investor-owned utilities have. But residents are not going to have a direct voice in managing that system, right? That happens at the utility level. And that's pretty different than if they go with the county water district. So in that case, consolidation would require boundary changes to go through the county LAFCO. Rates would be set by the county water district board in compliance with Prop 218, and residents would vote directly for that county water district board. So again, we see kind of different implications for residents based on which hypothetical system this mobile home park might consolidate with. So again, to just illustrate some of these by the different types, general purpose governments have some really obvious pros. They integrate water resources management planning and with other local planning, and that can have, some benefits. They also tend to be more visible and known to local residents. Elected officials of our cities and our counties are some of the more known representatives locally than others, right? But there's also, and they have wide-reaching legal and financial powers. So there is a lot of power in those general purpose governments to get certain things done. But there are also cons to consolidating into general purpose governments. These can result in large-scale changes for customers, as we've already talked about, particularly annexations into cities. So water service can also be impacted by political expediency and crises, right? We're wrapping our water planning, which has benefits with other politics, but also that can have downsides. And like most of our local government, like all of our local governments, residents can only vote in those elections if they're US citizens. So for independent special districts, as I said, there's more than 11 serving drinking water in California. And one of the pros of these districts is that they're really specialized. They have fewer restrictions related to service areas because unlike cities, they don't have as broad of reaching powers, which makes their service area a little bit easier sometimes to expand. And due to those narrow authorities and functions, annexation into a special district is likely less disruptive to residents or involves less change for residents than annexation into a city. But as always, there are downsides. So independent special districts are costly and difficult to establish. I'm sure there's a couple people on this call who've been through that process. And they also decentralize decision-making, so that can potentially reduce resident in general purpose districts. You must be a US citizen to vote in elections. And I'll just note, and Justin will come back to this at the end of the hour, but as we've mentioned, there are more than 11 types of independent special districts serving drinking water in California, and they do have differences among them. So while we're talking about them at a high level here, it is important to understand there are differences in statutory requirements and authorized powers between them. And so in the guide, in the appendix of our guide, we have a 8 or 9 page table that really breaks down some of these differences by type of independent special district. And Justin will revisit this at the end. So for investor-owned utilities, this is kind of, they provide water service for profit and are regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission. And some of their pros is that they are able to, and in some cases mandated to, provide low-income rate assistance programs, as I already mentioned. The board may have economic incentives and legal requirements to really think long-term in the provision of water services. But there's downsides, one of which we already discussed is the lack of direct representation for customers. And the board of the investor-owned utility has obligations to shareholders in addition to customers, right? So there's kind of, sometimes we think of it as dueling priorities, profit and water service. And they're not, importantly, investor-owned utilities are not subject to open government and transparency laws. So that's a really big difference for residents, especially when there is conflict or challenges happening. There's not necessarily those same opportunities to go to open meetings or to request documentation among investor-owned utilities. So nonprofit water providers, this is mostly mutual water companies, some homeowners associations under different mutual benefit cooperative structures. And one big pro of these that I think many people might be aware of is that they're pretty easy to create. You basically kind of draw up an association and register it. They're pretty easy to create. They're also pretty easy to amend and dissolve because we don't have to deal with the CPUC. We don't have to deal with LAFCO. And they're pretty flexible. There's significant discretion left to local bylaws. So you can kind of write up what this association looks like based on the desires of local residents. And in this case, all shareholders, which includes non-US citizens, can have a direct say in governing the association. But on the drawback side, generally, there's no representation for renters. There's some opportunities for proxy voting, but really associations, mutual water companies are kind of directed by homeowners. There's also limited regulatory oversight of mutual water companies, which can be a downside, especially if service isn't up to what residents are hoping for or want. And again, these nonprofits are not subject to open government and transparency laws. So lastly, and I know this is a lot, I kind of warned you up front, but this will be the kind of last in-depth slide, and then we'll move back out. So joint powers authorities, and you'll notice that the pros and cons of joint powers authorities are very similar to the umbrella organizations that I talked about before. And that's because umbrella organizations most often are joint powers authorities. So this is kind of a new governing entity that, that is existing in addition to the pre-existing water systems. As I said, pros, really easy to create, amend, dissolve. They're tailorable. You can write these agreements to do just about anything local residents might want, and they don't require regulatory approval. But again, they create redundancies. They are limited to what exercising common powers to all member agencies. So as Armando mentioned earlier, they may not be able to do everything you want them to do. Their powers are pretty limited in some cases. And sometimes one important thing I don't think I said before is that decision-making in joint powers authorities can be slow. And oftentimes decision-making in these joint powers authorities is created so that first the members have to decide at their own board meetings, and then it has to go to the joint powers authority meeting. And that can really add time to making decisions. And that's something important to be aware of when kind of deciding to move forward with a JPA. And again, can be easily dissolved potentially. So before I hand it off to Greg, kind of zooming back out, consolidation designs involve trade-offs. I think that, to me, the big takeaway is there's no silver bullet, there's no perfect consolidation, there are trade-offs. And so it's important that we understand these implications, and ideally we evaluate and compare alternatives. And we may decide to go with the alternative that's best suited to local resident needs. So for example, you may have an option between annexation or extraterritorial service agreement, and for residents to really understand what the trade-offs are there and to pursue the alternative that's best locally. But even where we don't have those options, and it's kind of this or some other solution set that isn't consolidations, we really do need to understand the implications to understand how this project's going to play out. And so I think the take-home message I hope you leave this presentation with is that it's important to evaluate and compare benefits and drawbacks and to understand the implications of both design, how the consolidation is approached, and governance, who is going to govern that consolidated system post-consolidation. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
Thanks, Kristen. Hey, everyone. So I'm going to run through, as it says here, 9 key considerations for evaluating alternatives and maximizing benefits with a prospective consolidating entity. Next slide. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly because I think this is where the report and some of the tools best serve you. But there are 9 different sort of categories of considerations. We recognize that that we identified. We recognize that these are categories, so there's lots of subsets and questions you'd really want to ask within each of these categories. But also a lot of them bleed together, especially when you look at, for instance, 3 through 5 here, all related to financial aspects of new prospective entity. And I would say, even though we're starting with scope of powers and authorities, really number 9, access to safe, reliable drinking water is the objective that all water systems are looking to carry out, and we want them to carry out whether consolidating or not. Next slide. So again, we're going to run through these 9 quite quickly here. I'm not going to read all of the text. Encourage you to look at the report. I'm just going to read some of the questions that you see here to see the different attributes and how we're suggesting could be helpful to think about them. When it comes to scopes of powers and authorities, some questions that are relevant are what local powers and authorities will be gained or lost with the transition into a new prospective governing entity, as well as is the prospective governing entity authorized to provide all the necessary and desirable functions, which we recognize, again, can vary case by case, although some are also, there are necessary functions across all cases. Next slide. Another key consideration is around implications for the provision of other services and powers, in particular, to make it practical. Do any of the consolidation partners provide services that other than drinking water, namely wastewater, sometimes power, trash? If so, how will these services be performed after consolidation? And can the proposed consolidation result and other changes to essential services likely to impact residents? Next slide. Then we come again to sort of 3 sets of, let's call them loosely, financial considerations. First and foremost, we'll cover sort of the revenue side of things and recognize that under different governance types of systems, there are different authorities and responsibilities and ways of raising revenue, requirements for raising revenue, and establishing rates. And that really has very practical implications all the way down to, well, affordability, which is a 3rd subtopic here. But another, well, we'll go ahead to TMF capacity, related to, which stands for technical, managerial, and financial capacity. Recognize that in addition to the sort of pure financial considerations, there's questions like, is there enough staff and volunteer capacity to implement and operate consolidation proposal? Will the proposal, and this is a very sensitive topic, of course, create operational or managerial redundancies? How might these be reduced? And I think you could also turn that around to say, what additional technical capabilities and staffing needs will be needed to operate the proposed consolidation, and are sufficient staff available? And again, we recognize case by case, you may have one of 2 sides of this coin, or maybe even 2 at the same time. And then last but not least, when it comes to financial implications is affordability. And the main question is, how will the proposed consolidation impact water rates? We again recognize that in some cases, systems pre-consolidation may not have formal rates or rate structures, at least to analyze. But additional questions here include, how will rate changes impact low-income residents specifically? And what are some of the non-rate financial policies or affordability policies of the utility, including policies around non-payment? I will say we tried to work to answer some of these questions in a project last year with a graduate student using existing data, and we found that there wasn't a lot of data essentially to analyze that allows us to get at empirically what, with existing consolidation examples, what have been affordability impacts. So we came up more with a way to potentially collect data and analyze that into the future. But I think it's pretty much an open question in the aggregate rather than case by case. What is the affordability impact of consolidations? How does that vary by major system type and over time and by region? Next slide. Then we come again, and something I think Kristen already covered pretty extensively, to representation and transparency, which varies quite a lot by major governing entity type as well as subtype. But important questions are both who's eligible to vote for, as well as serve as directors in the prospective governing entity, huge differences by system type, as well as what requirements for transparency and public participation is the prospective governing entity subject to. Next slide. Another category that's important, and I think kind of relates back to the first, powers and authorities, is around flexibility and administrative transaction costs, and a lot of, I would say, things that, at least from the outside, can be difficult to anticipate in advance. For instance, any questions we ask here, or if not already in existence, what is necessary to form the prospective governing entity that, again, isn't at the top of everyone's list, and what's required to make service area changes now and in the future that relate to a lot of local development plans, ambitions, and constraints more broadly. Next slide. I think we only have 2 more here, so I'm going to power through and then turn it over to Justin. But I think 2 additional considerations are around sustainability and climate resilience that are increasingly important. And some questions to ask here are around, will the proposed consolidation add or decrease water sources and water storage capacity? Essentially, how is water supply itself affected with the change in governance? Relatedly, and it relates back to TMF, of course, will the proposal help build financial reserves for emergencies and ongoing maintenance? And then specifically, this is so important, especially for a lot of small systems, but also larger systems. Increasingly, will the consolidation project meet or increase fire protection needs? And then last but not least, like I said at the outset, the goal here for water systems in general is access to safe, reliable, affordable water for all, as is mandated by the human right to water in California. So the question here is, overall, will the consolidation proposal increase access to safe and affordable drinking water in the region? And in particular, how can voices of those impacted by legacies of discrimination, exclusion through land use planning, water infrastructure, local political decisions, how can their voices be centered in this decision and in a prospective new governing entity? I think that's the end of my slides. And so I want to turn it over to Justin to make it super practical.
I'll do my best to do that, I guess. So we'll just go over really quick some of the toolkit and resources at the end of the report after talking about all these kind of big ideas. The main idea of this report was to have something practical that folks could use. And so I think those 9 sort of considerations that Greg talked about, the 2 ways to sort of think about those is prioritizing your outcomes. So what are you actually trying to accomplish, but also looking to maximize benefits and like what's the sort of best benefit that you can get, right? I think like it's pretty obvious. I think we all know when a system's failing and that there's things that need to be addressed, like inadequate TMF or other kinds of problems like that. And that, then consolidation is something that we start exploring frantically, but we don't have to stop there, and looking to maximize benefits over the long term and to build resiliency over the long term can actually be done in a more proactive fashion. So looking at potential consolidation partners kind of before things get to a crisis point. And so, yeah, so in order to do that, we wanted to put together a toolkit that could be useful, I guess, which would be helpful for this. Next slide, please. So one sort of set is we have a lengthy kind of toolkit here with a number of worksheets that people can use. There's an abbreviated link here at bit.ly consolidation tools that you can go to at any time, and it's referenced in the report itself several times as well. So you can also find it there, tacked on the end. The idea of these toolkits is that they're sort of a living document that we may, upgrade or alter at times as policy changes or as things change. So if you have feedback on them, we're definitely open to hearing them. There's kind of 5 different tools in the kit. One is a worksheet for looking at how to explore potential partners. One is a worksheet to help identify what type of consolidation might work best for you all, if you're looking at something like that. One is a number of key questions that you'd want to answer before considering a project consolidation. One is a worksheet to evaluate if consolidation would help problems, so it's more problem-oriented than solution-oriented. And then the last one is a side-by-side worksheet that you can use to compare 2 potential partners in a consolidation project that you could look at. And so the idea is that these are fairly simple to use, that you could go through each one's only a few pages and hopefully help structure your thinking about potential consolidation projects. Next slide. The other part is this massive appendix. It's like this 12-page long table that breaks down the different varieties of governments or other governance structures in the private sector that might end up governing a water system. The thing about consolidation is you're going to have, as we talked about, when you may have 2 different governance structures, and merging them together can create other kinds of issues and things like that. So the idea about this table is that it's a quick reference sheet that you can go to and find quick facts about either the potential consolidating system or the potential receiving system. There's 5 main tables in there. One is this one here, just general information. If you're unfamiliar with what the distinction is between a county service area and a county water district, for example, you can go here and get that answer very quickly and find the enabling act that'll let you get into the weeds if you desire to do that. Another table covers the different powers and authorities that they have. While particularly independent special districts have similar powers and authorities, they're not identical. And then things vary substantially, kind of moving away from special districts in terms of what sort of powers that they may have. The third table covers what statutes say about forming, altering, dissolving, or collaborating for that system. Some districts and other types are designed to collaborate and work with other folks, and other ones are designed not to do that. And so that table will help you sort that out. One's about how they fundraise and raise revenues. Public ones in particular have restrictions about how much revenues that they can raise, and so it talks about that. And the last one's about transparency and representation. So how open will proceedings be for people, and what sort of representation do those people have, whether it be indirect or direct, and who's allowed to vote, and sort of the considerations that Kristen mentioned earlier. So next slide. I think that's about all we have. We still have some time to open for questions for folks. I know that was a lot of content to sort of take on, so we're eager to hear what people want to talk about. And feel free to put questions in the comments or raise your hand, whatever size either is easier for you.
I'll just note, I see a lot of discussion around JPAs in the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in about that.
Yeah, I can go ahead and I put a couple thoughts in there. One thing that I've seen is that especially so two things. JPAs, especially when there's like a big power discrepancy between two water systems, you may find a situation where, at least I guess I'm speaking from experience here, but like where one of the larger of the two systems, presumably the receiving system, may be pushing for or have a preference for a JPA because it doesn't change their situation much. But for the smaller system that's being absorbed, especially if the small system already has significant TMF challenges, a JPA actually is going to complicate a lot of things, because now if you've got a volunteer board that's struggling to meet quorum, struggling to hold meetings, doesn't have a fully isn't fully staffed, doesn't have legal or engineering consultants that are regularly available, you may end up in a situation where you're actually doubling the amount of work for that smaller system, because instead of attending one board meeting per month, now you've got to attend 2 board meetings per month. And especially where there's that power discrepancy between the two, you may end up in a situation where the larger of the two systems is effectively driving all decisions. So I have a hard time. I think somebody else in the chat said this, and I agree. JPAs tend to be more functional when the two systems are already, larger and fairly functional to begin with. Those are just some of the thoughts that I had about JPAs.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think those are all really good points. And I think, and Katrina also mentioned that I think is a good point. One of the ways we sometimes get to JPAs is around this job loss question. And I think that's something Greg and Justin and I are interested in putting a finer point to, because it's certainly a sensitive local issue. No one wants to be out of job, right? A general manager or a system operator. And yet at the same time, a lot of our consolidations have the opposite problem of like lack of staff. And so managing those two in the context of JPAs is an important question. I see a question from Kira Brown about speaking to the challenges of redefining political boundaries associated with merger consolidations. How is LAFCO involved, and what are the roadblocks to redefining political boundaries? So I'll start with this, but then I'll pass it to Justin, because we are working more on this right now, and hopefully we'll have more to share soon around LAFCOs and local planning, because this is a big question, and would love to hear from you all about where you're encountering challenges or questions in this space. But generally, LAFCO comes into consideration when you're talking about local districts, so local independent special districts, as well as general purpose governments, cities and counties. And LAFCOs are not involved when you're talking about mutuals, investor-owned utilities, whatnot. But when we're in the local government sphere, LAFCOs have to generally approve boundary, service area, and sphere of influence changes. And so in a merger where you have two separate districts that are potentially combining into one, there's different ways that you might go about that. It could be you dissolve one of those and grow the boundaries of one to encompass the other. It also could be that you dissolve both and you create a new district that encompasses both. Like those are, and there might be other ways to do it, but those are kind of the two I've seen, both of which obviously require LAFCO to approve those new boundaries. And if you're creating a new entity, you're also going to have to generally do a public election around the creation of that new district, which is something LAFCO is involved with, but obviously also the county has a role in facilitating that election. There are fees involved with working through LAFCO. Many LAFCOs do have fee waivers, but each LAFCO in each county is different. And so one of the challenges we've heard from TA providers is those differences can be frustrating and maybe unknown until you get into the weeds of a project. So we're working on trying to figure out how we can better characterize and provide information about county LAFCO preferences and expectations. But generally, it requires close coordination with LAFCO. And the main advice Justin and I've heard is the importance of early interaction with LAFCO, because if they do have specific preferences or local policies that influence how you pursue a project, you want to know about those earlier rather than later. And so on kind of all sides, we hear that early engagement with LAFCO to understand their local nuances in these questions is really important. Justin, do you have things to add on that?
I mean, the only thing I'd add to that is that, LAFCO's, we think about water system consolidation all the time, particularly the three of us, because we're kind of big nerds about this stuff. But like LAFCOs are not really consolidation tools necessarily. It's a really small part of what they do. Many of them haven't worked on a water system consolidation or any kind of system consolidation. And they tend to think of them, like Kristen said, as dissolutions. They're much more concerned with like overall planning priorities than kind of water planning generally. And in many counties, the LAFCO is actually just an extension of the planning department effectively, even though it's technically independent. And so they're going to care more about land use implications of what you're trying to do than perhaps water implications in many circumstances. So I think that's like something that we probably don't think about, but has spillover effects particularly when a city is taking over an area or some other kind of entity that does land use planning as well.
Any other questions? I think we have a few minutes. Questions or even comments on these things or things you all have seen in projects?
One maybe question, and I don't know if it even really falls within the scope of strictly quote unquote consolidations, but I'm curious, frequently consolidation projects include may include a component that also includes extending service to previously unserved domestic well areas. And I'm wondering if anything in this guide addresses those types of situations or if that's outside the scope of this guide.
Great question, Ryan. And we should have said this up front. So we can, for the sake of this guide and for several of the projects we're working on, we are perceiving extension of service into domestic well communities or into a state small water system as a consolidation. They are unique. So we would consider that under the umbrella. And I believe and hope that I think a lot of the guide can be useful in those cases. And in that case, we're not so concerned with what exists before. Those residents are all kind of, assuming costs of management for their own wells themselves, for example. But understanding the implications of extraterritorial service versus annexation for those residents is, equally important. And I think the toolkit resources about identifying kind of those alternatives and trade-offs could easily be used with a domestic well community versus a small regulated water system. So we consider it within the realm of this, and hopefully these resources are useful, but acknowledge that those projects have unique characteristics, and one of which being you have to work directly with land homeowners, right? You're working directly with residents rather than working with a system, which has pros and cons. And in some cases can be easier, in some cases actually is way harder. Or actually probably depending on the question at hand, it varies. But so yeah, we are considering consolidation very broadly. And I should have started this whole presentation off with that. And as Justin mentioned, in the land use world, they talk about this not with the word consolidation, but with dissolutions, sometimes with mergers. In the CPUC and investor-owned utility world, they call these acquisitions, right? But this umbrella of expanding who is served, either service area or residents of a regulated water system, for us is falling into consolidation. I see one more comment, and then we can maybe pass it off. Maureen says, most projects I've been involved with have one option for consolidation because there's one receiving system in the vicinity. In this case, evaluating options for governance isn't needed, but it's the toolkit's still helpful. Yeah, so this is a point well taken, and we struggled with this in putting the guide together because saying alternatives and options implies you have them, right? And again, you may not have them, but understanding what the implications of whether that's a city or a special district is important. And I know I've heard from TA providers that, for example, private well residents were really opposed to the idea of annexation because they'd heard about annexation into cities. But in their specific case, actually, it was annexation into a county water district, which looked far different than annexation into a city. And when that was clarified for them, they came on board with annexation. And so I think even when there aren't options, like understanding how these considerations play out in our projects, like hopefully is useful. And that's what we're hoping to put a finer point on. But yeah, point is very well taken. Well, with that, I think we can pass it over to Jordan. Thanks, everyone, and excited to continue this conversation into yet another tool, because we kind of worked on these simultaneously, and it was fun to work alongside Jordan. So we'll take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. And yeah, great job, Kristen, Greg, and Justin on that. That was great seeing. And let me go ahead and share my screen. All righty. Is everything looking okay on y'all's end? All right. Yeah, just another intro. My name's Jordan Hong. I'm a senior software developer and project manager at Flow West. For those of y'all that haven't encountered Flow West in your work, we're an environmental consulting firm that specializes in natural resource management and eco restoration services. So our capabilities range from engineering, planning, and then where I kind of fit in is the software development, data science, data analysis part of the company. And so we've been working with the Water Foundation and have gotten a lot of assistance from the water boards to build this pilot web application in hopes of providing a valuable tool that small water systems and technical assistance providers can utilize to help alleviate some of the pain points surrounding consolidation projects. So those pain points mentioned were that, and I'm sure y'all are very familiar with it, is that one common reason that consolidation and regionalization projects don't move forward is just that lack of important information about how they would affect water rates and costs. So that requires pretty in-depth, complete feasibility studies that have to take into account the cost of consolidation as well as asset replacement if there is no consolidation. But then at the same time, you don't really get to that point in projects because that lack of information, lack of community interest makes it kind of hard to convince people to spend those public funds on projects. So kind of to address this chicken or egg problem, the Water Foundation, the Water Board wanted to find and explore ways that communities could kind of get that information early on in the process and generate that interest in that discussion. Yeah, and so that's kind of where our application comes in and is hopefully able to help. So we've kind of dubbed it this step 0 cost estimator tool. So just very initial stages of the process. A tool that can provide high-level ballpark estimates of the cost of consolidation, as well as alternative costs for asset replacement. And just, yeah, if there's no consolidation undertaken. And yeah, so the tool would fit in as this preliminary tool, enabling communities to compare these cost options and gain understanding of the benefits and drawbacks of each approach. And yeah, hopefully these initial numbers can just generate that interest and discussion between community members and technical assistance providers and other involved parties to move forward with the process and get into the more complete feasibility studies and those more complete numbers. And then so in software development, most of the time we have this initial goal of building a minimum viable product. So it's the version of the application that has just enough features to deploy it, get it out live, so that we can get users interacting with it, providing feedback, and then beginning kind of a more iterative development process. And then so for this project, we worked with the Water Foundation and the water boards to identify those features that could make up the MVP, the minimum viable project. We tried to identify kind of what the scope was, what features would help to begin solve that problem, and what we could develop initially, just so we could get it out to the water systems and TA providers to gather feedback of what's helpful, what isn't, what's still needed. So that's kind of maybe some of the points that we'll be able to get today. So this slide and the next one are going to talk about those features. So the application itself is kind of broken into the two parts that I've been mentioning, the consolidation and the capital improvement aspects that go into this process. For the consolidation part of the application, we wanted to allow the user to select their water system, pre-populate it with as much relevant data as we could to kind of make the process smooth and easy, but also allow them to interact with the application so that it is more of an interactive tool rather than a spreadsheet or just a document. And then, yeah, see how those adjustments factor into the end cost, and then providing that information, that data in user-friendly visual formats and exportable reports. And then on the capital improvement side, we wanted to take into account the cost of asset replacement, treatment costs, and the overall kind of cost per system and per connection of not undertaking a consolidation project. So for those features, it kind of works in conjunction with the consolidation side. So after identifying your water system, you would, okay, and I can answer that question after this, but yeah, so you would pick water system components that accurately represent your water system in mind, and then the application is going to use stored data and formulas to make those cost calculations for the components, and then display that cost and summary breakdown. And then one of the prominent pieces of feedback we got early on was that treatment costs were a huge factor in the overall capital improvement side of the cost breakdown. So we worked on building that feature into the application as well. And then, yes, Joe, I see your question. So data and formula sources. So we use the consolidation analysis done by Corona and UCLA that has a really expansive list of water systems and data relevant to each water system, such as like population, connections, the receiving water system that it would be associated with, and a lot of the formulas that we use came from that analysis, as well as the 2021 and 2022 needs assessment. And then on the CIP side, we're using the small water system budget calculator as kind of the starting point basis of the data and the formulas that we're using. And so for what data is entered into the program, some of it is built into the application as like behind the scenes data that the application is going to draw from. Other portions of the application are going to be user input. So we'll pre-populate the data with what we have if we have it, but the user can adjust it with input fields and sliders, and you'll see once we get into the demo. And then a next step that we would really want to do, and I have a slide for next steps, but hook up the application with live API data. So I know there was the Drinking Water Watch public water system API that went live this year. And so that would be kind of a next step, a next feature that we have in mind for this application is being able to query and bring in data from sources that are getting regularly updated. And then Ryan, for CIP cost estimates, can you adjust the amount of the project cost that is anticipated to be funded by grants rather than loans? So we haven't implemented any functionality in terms of financial assistance and how those get factored into the costs. And so not at the moment between grants or loans. And then, is there any need for TA providers to summarize? Okay, sorry, question for the water board. But yeah, let me get into the app and maybe some questions will be answered and maybe there will be more questions. All right. And then I was also going to share this link in the chat for people that want to play around with the app as we go along, and that would probably result in additional feedback and questions as well. All right, so here's the main page of the application. We tried to add as much descriptive explanation text and possible to kind of hopefully detail the process of how the application is used and what the intent is. So the first step is you're gonna select the water system that you are interested in seeing costs for. So like I said, the list of water systems is coming from the consolidation analysis report, as well as help with the water board kind of filling in data gaps where there was some. So you can search through this to kind of get to what you are wanting to explore. This dialogue, again, this might look familiar from the analysis, but you'll have data about the joining system, the receiving system, information possibly about the route between the two systems, if that's relevant. If the water system that you are trying to look for isn't in the app, so I'll go off of like Kristen's example. If it's not in the app, you can still enter it, and what will be done is just using default values in the application if we don't have more accurate data for that information. But I'll go back to my example for Alpine Acres. You'll see that this number of connections and the distance to the receiving system are coming from the data set that we have. And then, so like I kind of mentioned earlier, there's going to be values that are stored in the application. So we have the number of connections for Alpine Acres, and we have the distance to the receiving system. And then some of that cost data is also being pre-populated by the application. So 6,600 for connection fees or $155 per feet of pipeline. Those are stored in the application, but adjustable by the user if those are values that either the user knows needs to be adjusted or just wants to play around with seeing how adjusting values affects the total cost and the cost per connection. Earlier, there was a comment about grants and loans, and the initial kind of quick implementation of how we can try to account for financial assistance is kind of giving this contingency slider the ability to go into the negatives to kind of account for funds that the water system would be receiving. On the right hand side, you'll see as we adjust these values, costs are being updated. We have this donut chart on this side, and then if you toggle over to the details tab, you get a more detailed breakdown of which costs are going into these categories. Design costs. I'm not sure. I'll look into if we're accounting for design costs in there. I think right now I'll have to look and see if it was included in either the admin cost or not, but if not, again, adjustable if needed. And then, yeah, we're doing the planning and construction, elevation costs, if that receiving water system, if it's relevant, regional, and inflation. So that's kind of where these costs are coming from. And then down here we have the export. I'll save that functionality for when we get over to the capital improvement side, just so that report is fully filled out. And then down here we are detailing the methodology of what data and formulas we're using, where we're getting it from, and how the application is using it. So data, cost variables, formulas for both the consolidation and the capital improvement side. I know I kind of breezed through this part, but I wanted to pause here and kind of open it for questions, feedback, critique on the consolidation portion of the application before we moved over to the capital improvement side.
Jordan, there is a question in the chat from Katrina.
Yes.
Yeah, she asks, can you pause on the breakout of the cost? And then another question from her, it looks like the planning and construction might include design costs.
Yeah, I'll have to read back on the needs assessments to see if they detailed that information. Oh, sorry, the methodology, yes. Yeah, so this one is detailing kind of that dialogue that we opened up between joining and receiving system. This one is kind of all the behind the scenes cost variables that are either adjustable to the user. So this was one of the fields with an input slider. And then some of these are going to be behind the scenes, non-adjustable ones for some of the adjustments like elevation or the regional adjustment percentages. Who has access? So the data that is being used by the application right now is just coded into the code base. So I think from discussions, there was maybe the idea of having admins who could update these variables going forward to kind of keep it more accurate as costs and formulas get updated. But yeah, right now these values are just baked into the application, if that answers your question, Joe. And then systems that you work with other than populated, the source, yeah, came from that consolidation analysis, and then also from the water board. But definitely happy to look back and see if we can get a more expansive list of water systems and data for those water systems. And then, yeah, Katrina, let me know if I need to keep scrolling down. These are just a lot of cost variables. And then, yeah, these are some of the formulas that are being used by the application. Most of them are pretty similar to what is detailed in the consolidation analysis and the needs assessments. Right. If there's not too many, and obviously continue to add questions to the chat and I'll get to them, but we can go over to the capital improvement side. And then there's also time for questions at the end as well. So yeah, switching over to the capital improvement side. Everything in terms of the water system that you selected, and if you were to have adjusted the number of connections, that's all brought over. The cost summary up here is keeping your values for the consolidation side so that you can get that kind of comparison view. But for the capital improvement side, the idea is that you would add the components that your water system has, or that you project it might need in the future, so that you can kind of see the costs of what it'll take to kind of maintain going forward. So in this dialogue, and I apologize ahead of time if the values I use in this demo don't make realistic sense. I'm just going to add a bunch just to kind of hopefully get a good idea of what the application does. But yeah, so we tried to build out a decently expansive list of components. It was kind of difficult finding a good source of data for populating our application with water system specific data and accurate costs for those. So here you would go in, identify the components that make up your water system. You can copy over or transfer over between existing and new components to kind of accurately distinguish between the two. And then on adding, it would populate your two tables, existing and new. So for the unit cost, you'll kind of see there's like some pretty specific numbers and then some more rounded numbers. For the water components, or the water system components, where we were able to identify a formula or a way of kind of calculating a more accurate number, we use that, and some of these are calculated using the water system details such as connections or population. Others, which are a little more rounded, we just kind of worked on getting a, again, ballpark estimate for what that component may cost. So yeah, after adding it to the table, you can edit the white columns. So the gray ones are disabled, but quantity, you can adjust the unit cost if you have a better idea of it. Lifespan, again, we kind of used a pre-populated value for different categories of component types, but those are adjustable on change. Those dollar values are updated. And then some of the components take a measurement. So whether it's length or volume, adding that measurement cost is going to affect the installed cost. So this might look familiar for the small water system budget calculator. That was kind of the idea. but same thing down here, just for new components. And then the table breaks it down for annual reserve, and monthly per customer. The total gets brought up here as well as up into the summary table. And then, so yeah, that's the water systems component. And then kind of what I mentioned earlier was, after initial feedback, we got a lot of points that treatment costs are very important in the calculation of costs. So we worked on adding that. And again, I'm just going to add all of these to kind of give a good idea of what the application is doing. But yeah, table of the contaminant, the treatment, the capital cost of installing that treatment, as well as the annual operational cost. And these values are coming from formulas that are based off of the water systems details. Let's see. Troy's cost about inflation. Let's see if inflation adjustment percentage is going to be 4.7 right now. So I think that was the same value being used by the needs assessment, but we can adjust that if needed. Let's see. And then now that we've got kind of all of the portions of the cost calculator filled out, you'll see this summary table is populated up here. Again, values are probably not very accurate for y'all, but just an idea of the values that we're displaying and where they're getting broken down. And then that PDF now should be pretty filled out with kind of everything that you've been seeing from the application. So yeah, donut chart, information about the water system, that cost breakdown details table from the consolidation side, as well as on the capital improvement side, the tables that we all just saw, existing, new, and treatment costs. And then again, I can pause here real quick for questions about the capital improvement side before kind of going over to the last portion of the application, which is the resources tab. Yeah, I know there's kind of a lot of information on this panel, and I guess one thing I didn't show was like again, the idea of if it's not in the data set that we're using, we try to add that flexibility of being able to add it into the application, just as a way of being able to try to be as accurate as we can. So there's the ability to add in your own components if you have that information. And then okay. Yeah, I will definitely look more into the design cost question to make sure it's being accounted for, or if it is or not. And then yeah, just more methodology, formulas, data for the water system components and treatment cost values that were calculated. And then on this resources page, we just kind of wanted to include related, supplementary, auxiliary links to help cover topics that were maybe out of scope for this application. So definitely want to add the guide and tool that Chris and Greg and Justin just presented on. And then just any other resources that we can identify to help round out the application and just make this kind of a more robust, encompassing tool for people to use and get information about. So yeah, this resources tab is just links to external values or links. But yeah, before I go back to the slide deck, were there any additional questions, feedback, anything anybody wanted me to explore further within the application?
Can I ask a question, Jordan, just about like, I'm sure a lot of people are digesting this. Did you mention how the best way to provide feedback is like in the future, detailed feedback? Is there a like a key, well, like submit something, or is it just email or how?
Yeah, right now I've just been taking feedback from these meetings and emails. I'll have my email on the slide. But yeah, maybe when this kind of gets more live, we'll have a submit form for people to enter their feedback and have some automated emails sent over to me. But yeah, we're still kind of trying to identify the next steps of where this is gonna live once it goes fully live in public. But yeah, right now, email feedback would be great and really much appreciated. Here, will cost data in the tool be updated each year? The goal of this application is hopefully to keep it as relevant and updated as we can. I know there's the API for the water systems which hopefully that addresses the problem that a few of y'all are having of not all water systems appearing in the dropdown. Hopefully when we switch over to that API with live data, that kind of takes care of it. But yeah, we'd love to kind of have the opportunity to continue updating this. I know the needs assessments and kind of the findings in those are getting updated each year as well. So I'd love for this application to be able to keep up with those changes. So yeah, we are definitely wanting to find a way to keep it as relevant and updated as we can. All right, let me just switch back to the slideshow, and I'll have this tab up if any more questions come up about the application, and I'll just easily switch back and forth. All right, yeah, so next steps for our application. So the link that I just shared was our testing staging version. We are still trying to find where this application should live. I think we want to have it hosted somewhere where it's going to be widely accessible and used and easily found. So we're kind of working with the Water Foundation right now to make sure we can get this live and get it out to as many people as possible. But yeah, right now the staging testing application is available for people to use as kind of that pilot test version. Kind of what we're doing now, introducing this application to our end users and the people that we feel this could help the most. So yeah, just making sure it's known that this tool exists. And then those additional features, which yeah, I mean, there's been so much great feedback and ideas for this tool, and the initial kind of timeline of it limited what we were able to build. But I think, yeah, there's just such great resources out there that we could really make this application a lot more robust. So that one that I've mentioned a few times is that public water system API that I know is out. It's got updated live data that we can just query and hopefully help make this application a little more future proof. And then, yeah, I know a huge piece of feedback that we've gotten each time we've kind of demoed this is figuring out water rates and how, you know, our costs can get used to at least have a ballpark estimate of how it's going to affect water rates. So I think initially that was kind of a little beyond the scope of what we were able to do with that pilot application, but I know that would be extremely helpful for communities and TA providers. So it'd be really great if we were able to implement that into the application. And we've definitely had the discussions of how we could maybe do it. So I'd love to be able to continue that. And then, yeah, just additional features and metrics and values that the application could help to prevent these additional pain points and log jams. And kind of what I mentioned earlier was this iterative approach of having this application out there, having users use it and provide feedback, and we iterate on that and continue to develop features and functionality for the application going forward to, yeah, hopefully build out as useful of an application as we can to help out you all and the communities that you work with. And yeah, Rob, I see your comment. Yeah, I know there's been feedback of, yeah, maybe having the ability to kind of store an estimate and either come back to it later, or yeah, kind of build on that and do multiple estimates at once. So yeah, the ideas of great features are definitely not lacking. So I think there's definitely a lot of ways forward for the application to hopefully be useful. And yeah, I mean, y'all have been providing really great feedback so far and questions. But yeah, if there's any more on anything I mentioned in the slide deck or in the application, happy to try and answer as best I can. If kind of what Greg was saying, people need time to digest this and just kind of play around with the application. My email is this, and feel free to send any questions, thoughts, critiques over to me, and I will get back to you with that. Yeah, and I can continue to open it up for more questions if there's any. All right, well, if there isn't, thank you so much, everybody, for your time and your feedback and questions. A lot of the features that we've built into the application have come from the feedback that we've gotten during these demos. So we really appreciate it, and it's helping us make as best of an application as we can. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jordan. And also thank you to Greg, Kristen, and Justin. Awesome presentation. I really appreciate your time today. And before we end, we have an announcement for next month's training. Ibby, do you mind sharing your screen with the announcement, please? Thank you. Yeah, so next month we'll have a training Sorry, this slide disappeared.
Give me 1 second.
Oh, thank you.
It doesn't seem to be working, so I'll just share my screen. Maybe.
Okay, and we can see the slide. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, next month on September 27th from 1 to 3 p.m. we'll have a training on urgent drinking water needs. And also I'll put in the chat what you see there. We have a training evaluation form. Any feedback is appreciated. And also we will send out a copy of the slides you saw today, and also a link to the recording will be provided later this week. So I will put the evaluation form in the chat right now. So all of you can fill that out. But yeah, other than that, that's it. Thank you all for coming and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye all.